In the past few days, there were signs of perhaps a toning down of the tense standoff that seemed on cue to accompany the final pullout of U.S. troops in Iraq. Most notably, the country's Shiite prime minister backing off from the threat to fire ministers from the Sunni-backed Iraqi bloc. Well, this Thursday, dozens killed in the worst sectarian bombings in nearly 5 months. With the Americans gone, can Iraq's leadership overcome bitter, age-old rivalries and prevent the disintegration of a nation? Today in the France 24 debate, we're going to be looking at Iraq on its own. And for reporters, the France 24 investigative news magazine, James Andre went to Iraq. In a moment, we'll get a sense of the tension in a report that includes a tour of the so-called Sunni belt north of Baghdad. That's coming up. And also with us, he was Baghdad bureau chief for the French news agency AFP at the height of the violence. Dave Clark of the French news agency AFP, welcome back. And from Washington, she drew on her experience as an American aid worker in Iraq to write Barefoot in Baghdad, a story of identity. Manal Omar of the United States Institute of Peace, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
The France 24 debate, which, by the way, you can always follow or join in on the conversation in on Facebook and on Twitter, where our handle is at François F24. Now, before we look at the timing of Thursday's blasts, let's look at the bigger picture and see what James Andre found out in Iraq for reporters, the France 24 investigative news magazine.
Ain al-Assad is one of the largest military bases in Iraq. This vast 60-square-kilometer Air Force complex has 2 runways and a network of underground bunkers where Saddam Hussein used to hide his fighter planes. At the height of the conflict, more than 16,000 American soldiers were stationed here. It was the entry point for the coalition in Iraq. All GIs who served in the country passed through here. Today, the Americans are leaving.
Now the U.S. military representative hands al-Assad base to the Iraqi army.
The ceremony lasts only a few minutes. Papers are signed, pictures taken, and colors hoisted. Quickly, everyone gets back to more practical aspects of the transfer, such as inventory. The Americans take all the military equipment and leave the barracks and offices in working order.
This is the Air Force.
The Iraqi army is taking back an operational airbase with no planes.
Currently, we lack a lot of fighter jets and reconnaissance aircraft.
Saddam Hussein's air force was destroyed during the US invasion. The wrecks of fighter jets are still visible around the base, an arsenal that must be rebuilt. On the American side, soldiers can only display satisfaction that the mission is accomplished. All of them declare that Iraq is ready to take its destiny into its own hands.
They strong democratic background here for the last several years, and the challenge before them is to maintain that course and to come together as a nation, accepting of all their cultures and embracing their diversity as one Iraqi nation.
After 9 years of war and occupation, the Americans are withdrawing under heavy protection. The highways are blocked for convoys to pass under helicopter protection. Their departure leaves a void, both politically and in terms of security. While the majority of people welcome their retreat, the return to normality on the streets of Baghdad hides deep divisions between Shiites and Sunnis. Even the security forces display their religious and therefore political beliefs. Most checkpoints sport portraits of Imam Hussein and Shiite flags. We head to Sadr city to see what remains of the Mahdi army, the Shiite militia controlled by Muqtada al-Sadr. We're escorted by a member of the organization. This is Ashura, the Shiite pilgrimage that was prohibited under Saddam's rule. It commemorates the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, in Karbala. Thousands of young men march past the headquarters of the Sadrist party, flagellating themselves with chains. There are no weapons in sight, yet this is very much a power display.
The Mahdi Army, it's not an organization with membership cards or a militia, as some people claim. The Mahdi Army is made up of those who defend the truth, who fight for the truth, and who fight the Americans. That's what the Mahdi Army is. That's who you have here today.
To the sound of latmia, traditional flagellation music, tempers flare. Some even cut their scalp with swords to show their devotion to Shiaism and the cause of Muqtada al-Sadr.
We love you, Imam Hussein, for life and beyond. The United States and Israel, we will cut them up into pieces with the help of God Almighty.
The Sadrist party has 41 seats in the Iraqi parliament. Its military wing, the Mahdi Army, was officially disbanded. Yet, Ibrahim al-Jabiri, the representative of Muqtada al-Sadr in Baghdad, speaks openly of armed struggle.
We say to those responsible for the security of this country, we're with you if you want to counter any attack by Al-Qaeda, the scourge that came along with the American tanks and planes. God willing, with the strength of the resistance led by Muqtada al-Sadr, they will disappear.
The reason the Shiites are so determined to defend themselves is that they were persecuted under Saddam Hussein's rule. After the fall of the dictator, Shiites and Sunnis faced off in a bloody sectarian war. Members of both faiths had to flee their homes. This Shiite taxi driver was one of them. He wishes to remain anonymous to avoid retaliation. We will call him Ali. He fled the town of Abu Ghraib 4 years ago with his family. In this Sunni-majority province, the situation became too dangerous.
The American occupation has encouraged sectarianism in the country, and we had to flee our regions. There were people, militia, we didn't know them. I can't say who it was. There was no security. When we left in the morning, we didn't know if we would return alive.
Ali assures us that he has a large poultry farm in Abu Ghraib. Now, he lives here in Mashtal, a poor neighborhood on the outskirts of Baghdad, a former military base where the Shiites who fled the Sunni-majority provinces have built makeshift houses. For 4 years, Ali has lived in this slum with his wife and 8 children.
It's hard. There are 10 of us in the family. I work, I'm a taxi driver. Sometimes it pays, sometimes it doesn't. The 6 children who are here go to school, this one and this one. Life is hard. Look, soil falls on us through the holes in the roof.
Ali has never returned to Abu Ghraib. He says the city is too dangerous. It is located in the predominantly Sunni province of Al-Anbar, west of Baghdad. On our way there, we pick up an armed escort. During the war, the region was an Al-Qaeda stronghold. Traces of that bloody era are still visible. Today, the governor is inaugurating this bridge, rebuilt after it was blown up in October 2009. With roadblocks and checkpoints, security is tight.
Hello, I'm the Colonel. Behind me in the car is the communications advisor, then search everyone.
The police and army are present in large numbers. The governor of Al-Anbar, Mohammad Qassam, arrives surrounded by a massive escort. The highway is closed, and pickup trucks loaded with heavy machine guns guard the perimeter. The governor has already been targeted by 4 assassination attempts. He has lost a hand and uses a cane to walk. After the last attack in November 2011, he publicly denounced the involvement of the Mahdi Army.
This bridge was destroyed by terrorists, not armed militia. There are patriotic armed militias, and there are terrorists. I do not accept the idea that a patriot can destroy the infrastructure of his own country.
Among the armed groups that the governor considers as patriots, there is Al-Sahwa, the Awakening. It's a militia formed by Sunni tribal leaders who fought Al-Qaeda alongside the US Army. These 3 sheikhs are part of Al-Sahwa's high command. Thanks to their knowledge of the terrain, these men were able to neutralize the terrorist threat, a victory that cost them dearly.
This is the result of terrorism. Look, they killed all my brothers, 4 of my brothers, and I'm not even talking about my cousins and my uncles. I died a little bit every time too.
Each of these sheikhs heads a tribe and is able to mobilize thousands of fighters in a few hours. With the departure of the Americans, they are worried.
The sectarian current, I'm sorry to say, is very strong. Our sons joined the army, but when you look at the percentage of Sunnis, it is very low compared to that of the other confession.
We rely on God to protect us and our weapons to defend ourselves, just like we did in the beginning. We've kept our guns, we're ready to mobilize forces and fight with the children we have left.
Like the Mahdi army, Al-Sahwa was officially disbanded. In fact, the men and their weapons were simply transferred to the province's police. Hundreds of veterans of the struggle against Al-Qaeda, equipped with pickup trucks, armored Hummers, heavy machine guns, and rocket launchers. This unit is known as the Abariche Brigade, named after its real leader, Sheikh Ahmed Abariche. He lives in this protected fortress. He's a prime target for terrorist organizations. Most of his brothers and his father were murdered. Today, the sheikh feels marginalized by the government of Nouri al-Maliki.
If the central government continues on this path, we will have to become an autonomous province, and Iraq will become a federal state. It's the only way to avoid the marginalization exercised by the government. And if they don't respect the constitution, they'll lose their legitimacy, and what happened in Libya, Egypt and Tunisia will happen to them.
Salah al-Din and Diyala, the other 2 Sunni provinces of Iraq, have already declared their autonomy, despite opposition from the government of Nouri al-Maliki. In Salah ad-Din, when the local government voted in favor of autonomy, the Iraqi army withdrew. Here, in Tuzkormato, 400 police officers are left responsible for the safety of 120,000 people. An impossible task. Yet, the mayor believes the autonomy of the Sunni Triangle is inevitable.
With regards to appointments, we are marginalized. And there's pressure on the provinces from Baghdad. They deliberately make decisions that disadvantage certain regions. The problems of Iraq will never end unless the provinces become autonomous.
His model is only a few miles away behind these mountains. Kurdistan is Iraq's first truly autonomous province, another country altogether. Erbil, the capital, is prosperous. It has its own government and its own army of 80,000 men, an autonomy guaranteed by the Iraqi constitution. Marginalized, some Sunni leaders would like to see their provinces follow the same path, despite the risk of reinforcing divisions that could plunge Iraq into a violent sectarian war.
All right, James Andre's report, which you can see in Reporters, the France 24 investigative news magazine. James, who's with us again. A lot of guns in that report. How tense was it when you were out filming?
Well, I mean, the areas we went to are rather tense. Al-Anbar, for example, you need an escort. You can't stay in the streets of Baghdad for very long because it's a bit too risky. But still, it's a lot less tense than it was a few years ago. And even the tension between the Shias and the Sunnis is indeed on the rise, and there's a political crisis. But there's nothing to do with the violence that existed in 2006 or 2007, even with the bombings. You know, you used to have up to over 1,800 bombings a month back in those days, and we're around maybe 50 at the moment, or maybe a little more. But you know, it's still a lot less violent than it was when there was the full sectarian war on in Iraq.
And as we see in that report, you meet with some of the key leaders of the Al-Sahwa militia. Their turning over and joining the Americans was a key point during that U.S. occupation. Do you have a feeling that when you spoke with them, that they have a clear vision as to where they're going?
Well, I mean, no, it's kind of unclear. They're concerned. They feel marginalized. I mean, they all say that. We spoke to the governors of Al-Anbar. We spoke to the governors governor of Salah al-Din, and we spoke to the governor of Diyala. So that is really the Sunni triangle. So those are the three Sunni provinces, and the three governors were saying the same thing. Salah al-Din was already autonomous when we went there, had declared its own autonomy, which is not recognized by the central government right now. Diyala did it while we were there, and Al-Anbar hasn't done it yet, but probably will do in the weeks or months to come. So we did see this political tension on the rise. You can also tell that most people are not really are tired. They just want to, things to calm down and to come back to normal. But when you speak to the leaders, you can tell that indeed these militias are there. They're still there. They've been disbanded, but they're still there, and that the leaders are all struggling for more power in this void that the Americans have left.
All right, an important distinction between the leadership and ordinary citizens. Manal Omar, what were your thoughts? I know from all the time you've spent in Baghdad, what were your thoughts when you saw those images in that report from Sadr City, that Shiite stronghold of Baghdad?
Well, I think it's a very significant message, and it's worth pausing to think about what tomorrow is, which is National Army Day for Iraq. And the significance of the U.S. withdrawal this year, the fact that the strongholds of both Sadr City and Kadhimiya were the areas that were hit today is a very strong message that even the strongest areas the Iraqi security forces cannot protect, and therefore undermines the current government. At this point, most citizens, one of the top things that people are asking for is security, and if the government isn't able to provide that and it's undermined, then a lot of people will lose confidence in its ability to govern.
Dave Clark, when you see the report, you air places like Sadr City, when you were in Baghdad, basically no-go zones.
Yes, I stayed in Baghdad throughout 2006 and 2007 when there was a sectarian civil war going on in Baghdad. And in those days, it was very difficult for me to visit Sadr City. I think even though I was in the city pretty much for 13 months, I visited the fringes of it once, and it was difficult for me even to talk to people from that area. AFP would cover that by employing local reporters who could move more freely in that environment. But on those days, we wouldn't send Sunni reporters to Sadr City, and we wouldn't send Shiite reporters to Abu Ghraib. The situation then was very much divided, but the situation remains very much divided. The violence has gone down, but in effect, the violence has gone down because that civil war happened. And now the communities are physically divided as well as divided in terms of their political affiliations.
And when you see the report, what strikes you?
Well, I was interested to see in the report that the Sunni provinces are clearly looking to follow Kurdistan in becoming autonomous. There hasn't been a stable constitutional settlement since the end of the worst fighting. There's been two sets of elections now, but before each election, all the voters knew that the Prime Minister would be Shiite, that the Speaker of Parliament would be Sunni, that the President would be Kurdish, and that there would be some form of government of national unity. It's not an ongoing ruling democracy yet. It is a difficult compromise hammered out when there were still Americans in the country, and so that everyone feels they have a bit of a stake. But because there is no acceptance of what the constitutional rules are, Prime Minister Maliki has been able to gather more and more power to himself, and his legitimacy comes, as our colleague was saying, his legitimacy comes from his ability to provide security. After the horrors of the war, people need and provide security, and he was an unloved figure. He's still unloved, but he was an unimpressive figure who was chosen because he was weak initially, and he's managed to gain himself a measure of authority by ensuring security, at least in some areas, by even at one point confronting the Shiite militias from his own community. But bombings like we've seen today will obviously call a lot of that into question.
We're going to pick up on the issue of those bombings and of the role of Nouri al-Maliki when we return. You're watching the France 24 debate.